leaders to divest. And so over the last 20 years or so, there's been the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement led by Palestinians, including Palestinian trade unions. And some unions in the U.S. have tried to endorse BDS and talk about how their own funds, their own dues and pension funds, how they're invested in Israel. So that's one of the significant things I think about with the UAW's recent call for a ceasefire. They also created a new working group called the Divestment and Just Transition Working Group that's going to look into the UAW's own investments in Israel and talk about potentially divesting, as well as talking about, when they say just transition, they're talking about in the arms industry, because the UAW represents thousands of workers in U.S. weapons factories, weapons that are being sent to Israel. And if we want to talk about shutting down those factories, we also have to talk about what happens to the people who work there, who are union members. And so just transition is similar to the same idea of what happens to fossil fuel workers as we transition to a green economy, making sure, and this goes back to an earlier, in the 1970s, 80s, calls for economic conversion, or conversion from a wartime economy to peacetime economy. So the fact that the UAW's new leadership under President Shawn Fain has committed to trying to work towards these goals, I think, is probably even more significant than the calls for a ceasefire, because after all, ceasefire is sort of the bare minimum here.
Bill Fletcher, I wanted to bring you into this conversation. You're on the editorial board of The Nation, your new piece, Gaza, Biden, and a Path Forward. And you wrote for In These Times, the fascist movement's biggest threat, labor unions. Can you talk about what you mean?
Amy Wan, thank you for having me on the program. I just want to say one thing before getting into that question. The U.S. trade union movement has always been divided on international affairs. I mean, going back to the Spanish-American War, going to the Spanish Civil War, going to the Vietnam War, Central America, South Africa. What has been a generally consolidated position, going to your point, Juan, is at the level of the national leadership of the AFL-CIO and most unions, they've been largely in lockstep with U.S. foreign policy, but not always. Now, what's different is that when it comes to Israel and Palestine, up until fairly recently, at the national level, there's almost no discussion about alternative views as opposed to supporting Israel. And so that's what's changing, which is really, really important to emphasize. And one of the things, Amy, to your question, is that there is great fear within the union movement about what's going to happen in November 2024. And what will happen in terms of whether Biden or whoever gets elected. And so with the October 7th, the Hamas attack and the Israeli genocide following that, the union movement has been in a tailspin as to how to respond. And part of that response is to go back to its general position of supporting anything that Israel does. Another position is that of silence. And then a growing position, which we're now seeing, that's represented by the APW, UAW, NNU, and others, is to take a critical position on the views, on the policy of the United States and of Israel. And that's where we should have hope.